Hello and welcome to Competition in the Age of Ecosystems, a two-day virtual event exploring the new realities of ecosystem-based competition. I'm Stuart Craner, co-founder of Thinkers 50. I'm director of the Business Ecosystem Alliance. This event is a partnership between the Business Ecosystem Alliance, Outthinker, Thinkers 50, and the Higher Management Institute. We're delighted that people from more than 50 countries have signed up for the event. So thank you for joining us if you're with us live or watching a recording. A Mandarin translation is available for all of the sessions. Details of that are in the chat section. In addition to the live sessions, there are a number of fantastic pre-recorded sessions which are also now available on our website. As always, please let us know where you're joining from and ask questions in the chat or question box at any time during the session. We really appreciate your insights and input. And now to our next session, the power of serendipity. Modern life can feel like an endless sequence of cancelled plans, last-minute meetings, and delayed journeys. So how can we use unpredictability to our advantage? To explore this, we are joined by Christian Busch, best-selling author of the Serendipity Mindset and director of the CGA Global Economy Program at New York University. Christian has spent a decade as an organization founder and academic at NYU and London School of Economics, exploring how we can use uncertainty as a pathway to more joyful, purposeful, and successful lives. And who could resist that combination of joy, purpose, and success? Anchored in a science-based framework and peppered with inspiring stories, this session will capture how all of us can cultivate serendipity and turn uncertainty into opportunity, joy, and sustained success. Christian is joined by Victoria Stoyanova, who will reflect on her extensive experiences as global ecosystems manager at companies such as Facebook and Ernst & Young, as well as incubators, VCs, and communities such as Techstars and Second Home, to discuss how we can cultivate serendipity, community, and innovation in large and small ecosystems alike. Victoria is a semiotician by training, a word difficult to say when drunk, strategist by trade, and a people person at heart. Her work is about bringing people together. So it should be a really interesting connection between her and Christian's work. Christian and Victoria, welcome. I will hand over to you and then join you a little later for questions.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for the wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, wherever you are in the world. It's wonderful to be here with you today. I'm a big believer that most of the knowledge usually is in the head of the people who are in the room rather than in the heads of presenters. So please do feel free to put in the chat any ideas you have, anything that comes to mind, any questions, and we'll try to engage as much as we can also during the presentation now. As a first step, I'd love to take you on a journey of the power of serendipity, and then Victoria will take it from there and really take it into communities and ecosystems. And that journey really started in terms of I've been doing work as entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, ecosystem builder, community builder, and then later in academia. And what I found fascinating on this journey is that the most inspiring, purpose-driven, successful people, they seem to have something in common, which is that they intuitively cultivate serendipity. They have this ability to turn the unexpected into positive outcomes. And the more I've been working with companies like Hire and others and seen how they operate, the more I've realized actually serendipity and the serendipity mindset being at the core of how you cope in a world that is changing so fast that we have to consistently make the best out of the unexpected, especially as I think the conversation earlier showed also, a lot of the companies that are in the kind of ecosystems arena have to cope with those fast changing environments. So I'd love to take you on a journey of how do we develop this kind of mindset that helps us to connect the dots in this kind of fast changing ecosystem world that we live in. Being the German I am, here's a couple of slides to bring that point home. It really kind of starts with the premise that, look, at the end of the day, behind the curtain of ecosystems, there's people, right? There's human beings who in some way have to somehow make sense out of all the different challenges that they're facing in terms of customer needs, in terms of partner needs. And there's so many different stakeholders, of course, that are around. Brings coordination challenges. There's all these societal and environmental challenges that are extremely complex. There's a lot of uncertainty on the individual level. We all have, we just all had a collective near-death experience with COVID. And so there's a lot in there in terms of anxiety and transition and uncertainty. And so when you take all that together, the unexpected is at the core of a lot of the kind of success we're seeing, a lot of the kind of innovation, up to 50% of innovations essentially being now serendipities, partly out of necessity, partly out of essentially the kind of course of action. And so the question really becomes, how do we build a muscle for the unexpected, a mindset that allows us to cultivate serendipity and with it, this kind of innovation and impact. Now, to make sure we're on the same page, a couple of examples. Any ideas what this here might be? A couple of examples of serendipity. Any ideas? I think you can use the chat function here. Any ideas what this might be in front of you? It's usually a good sign when there's not so many people commenting on it, because this is essentially a couple of decades ago, a couple of researchers gave people medication against angina, the illness, and they realized unexpectedly there was some kind of movement in male participants' trousers. And what would we usually do? It would probably be like, oh my God, this is embarrassing. Let's ignore this, right? Let's just kind of pretend it hasn't happened and find a better way to cure angina. They did the opposite. They said, you know what? That's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of men in the world who might have a problem in that department. So why don't we develop a medication around this? And this is how Viagra, unexpectedly so, kind of became one of the best-selling medications. Here is the generic drug, sildenafil. Here's another example. Any ideas what that might be? You can use the chat function for any ideas you might have. Any ideas what that might be? Chicken fryer. So this is a sweet potato washing machine. It's actually Haier produced it, and it's a company I've been collaborating with for a very long time. And you know, I still remember walking through, and Stuart, we met there in Qingdao, walking through the exhibition space and seeing this and just being extremely excited about it. And the idea behind this was really that, you know, Haier's employees at some point realized that some of their users or some of their customers essentially use their washing machine not to wash clothes, but to wash potatoes, sweet potatoes. And you know, farmers have a huge need to wash sweet potatoes. And instead of just, you know, educating the customer and telling them, well, you know, don't wash your potatoes in this, it's not made for this, they did the opposite. They said, you know what, that's unexpected, but there's probably a lot of farmers in the world who have a similar problem. So why don't we build in a dirt filter and make it a potato washing machine? And that's how the sweet potato washing machine became this product you're seeing here. And that's really something, when you think about serendipity in ecosystems, I think Haier is an interesting example of this. If you look at this kind of here from the bottom up, you know how Haier has structured kind of its ecosystem, where it has these kind of key support units, you know, design, R&D, some kind of shared resources, finance, capital, tax. But then essentially it says, you know what, we want to incentivize people within our quote unquote ecosystem, within the kind of network of people who are here. We want to incentivize them to develop units, what they call micro enterprises, that can run with ideas, that can build things. Either on the left here, you see transformational micro enterprises, they are more incremental. So let's say you have a, you know, Haier, as you all know, is a, you know, they are smart home focused. So they produce washing machines, refrigerators, and so on. And so let's say there's a given refrigerator, and now someone comes up with an even smarter way for the refrigerator. That's great. Then they can try to get support for that and develop that on their own. But also, and I think that's where it gets really exciting, they have these incubation micro enterprises where the idea is, if you see something in the data, because you have such an aggregate amount of data through all these smart machines in the household, if you see something there that's unexpected but could be a really great idea, we'll invest into it and you can build your own company around that. And so that's really kind of the idea, what you see here at the middle, in the middle, that links it to serendipity, where the U+ network, the network, the kind of Internet of Things based network of all the smart appliances in the home and all the different stakeholders that are on it, you will see that customers might say something like, oh, I'm using my smart refrigerator to order apples and bananas, but I wished I could actually order potato juice. And then someone might say, wow, I didn't even know potato juice could be a product. Let's build a company around this. And so the fascinating thing here is what you see in companies like Haier, that once you develop this kind of platform that allows people to have visibility towards emerging customer needs and then invest into them, unexpectedly so, serendipitously so, a lot of the kind of smart potato washing machines might emerge. This is just an example. We can definitely talk more about this later, but the key point here really being, because they have this ability to aggregate a lot of data, based on this data, enabling people to come up with ideas. A lot of times these ideas will be very unexpected. And I've always enjoyed these kind of ideas that, in a way, the higher CEO used to be extremely focused on this idea that, hey, we're not a product company anymore. We're not just about refrigerators or washing machines. We are now a smart home platform. And what that means is that we don't identify by just, doing the next best refrigerator, but we want to understand how we can make your life at home better. And so our key competitor is not the white good companies of the world. Our key competitor is Amazon, it's Google, it's the other data companies. And I think that's a fundamental shift towards data, towards intelligence, artificial intelligence, where then you essentially enable people to say, okay, even if I have a video gaming company, maybe that video gaming company could be exciting for a refrigerator company, because that's the next kind of frontier for something to happen. And so you will see the variety of investments, more like an investor rather than a traditional company. But the long story short here really is, you will see things like the potato washing machine emerge because people are incentivized to spot unexpectedly emerging ideas in those kind of ecosystem. Here's another recent example, the Pfizer BioNTech, one of the first vaccines against COVID, and there was a company in Germany, BioNTech, that essentially was already researching on RNA related to cancer, and they realized, oh wow, we could probably use this to tackle the COVID disease, and they coped up with Pfizer and made that into a product. Now, if you think back in your own life, examples of serendipity, maybe how you unexpectedly met the love of your life, how you met your co-founder, how you met your ecosystem partner, you name it. It always seems like it's just something that happens to us, right? But one of the things that our research shows is that instead of something that just happens to us, like blind luck, being born into a good family or something, it's actually smart luck. It's the luck we create ourselves. And it's all about the idea that there's always a trigger, right? The serendipity trigger, like there's a farmer saying, we use your product differently. There's the kind of movement in male participants' trousers. There's you bumping into someone in a coffee shop and spilling coffee over them. But that's not enough, this kind of random moment. We have to do something with it. We have to connect the dots and then also have the tenacity to actually go through with it. And so once we look at serendipity, not as just something that just happens to us passively, but as something that essentially is the process of spotting and connecting dots, then we can create more potential dots, and I'll talk more about this, and we can learn how to connect the dots better. And by doing this, increase our capacity for innovation, for impact, but also for things like love and other unexpected good luck. And so serendipity as smart luck, as unexpected good luck, really being partly under our control and being one of the key necessity skills and capabilities for organizations and individuals in a fast changing world that's full of the unexpected. Of course, the problem is that we tend to miss serendipity all the time because we might not see the potential trigger, we might not be able to connect the dots, or we might just not have the tenacity to really go through with it. And I want to give you an example here of how often we might overlook potential serendipity in organizations, but also in our own lives. And so in this example, and what I'd love you to do is, I'd love you to reflect on, do you consider yourself to be a lucky or an unlucky person? And those of you who want to put it in the chat, do you consider yourself to be a lucky person or an unlucky person? Victoria says lucky with an exclamation mark. That's a great one. Monica says rather lucky. So on the continuum somewhere. James, lucky. Hugo, lucky. Osnat, lucky. Osnat, great to see you. Osnat is doing wonderful serendipity work in Israel. Richard, very lucky. Great. So very much on that continuum on the right. The reason I'm asking this is that those of you who consider themselves to be very lucky are more likely to be lucky in the future. Not because of some kind of voodoo type things, but because you will be more alert to the positively unexpected. And the positively unexpected is everywhere, right? And I want to give you an example. In one experiment, that's kind of like, there's a lot of different experiments, but this is one of the more entertaining ones, where they picked some, people who identify as very lucky and people who identify as very unlucky. So people who say, bad things tend to happen to me, I'm always in accidents. They pick one of each, and then they say, walk down the street, go into a coffee shop, grab a coffee, and then sit down. And then we'll have our interview or conversation. What they don't tell them is that there's hidden cameras along the street and inside the coffee shop. There's a £5 note, so money right in front of the coffee shop. And inside the coffee shop, there's this one empty seat next to this extremely successful businessman who can make big dreams happen. Now, the lucky person walks down the street, sees the £5 note, picks it up, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, they have a conversation, exchange business cards, potential opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person walks down the street, steps over the £5 note, so doesn't see it, goes inside the shop, orders the coffee, sits next to the businessman, ignores the businessman, and that's it. Now, at the end of the day, they ask both people, so how was your day today? And so the lucky person says, well, it was amazing. I found money in the street, made a new friend, and potentially an opportunity coming out of it. The unlucky person just says, well, nothing really happened. And this is something you can replicate in a lot of different contexts, that the way you look at the world, the way you frame the world will make it more or less likely that something positively unexpected can happen. And so in this case, there's the kind of alertness factor, right? So I don't know, take the example of you taking another street to work in the morning, and you actually consciously look around and see in the bookstore, oh my God, this book title could be a podcast. Like those kind of serendipitous moments, they depend on your ability to open your eyes and to be alert to things. But then also in this example, of course, we're seeing that the ability to connect with others, of course, especially in ecosystems, being a great way to also create opportunities. A lot of times serendipity, of course, is about teamwork, and it's about different perspectives. And I'm sure Victoria will dive deeper into that community dimension of it as well. For now, though, the key idea being we can influence our quote unquote luck in a lot of different ways, but one key way being to start looking for the quote unquote money in the street. Right? I find a lot of money in the street because I expect it to be there. Mostly pennies, unfortunately, so it doesn't really change my lifestyle, but there's a lot of people drop a lot of money. And that's, of course, in all areas of life where we might not see these potential triggers because we don't believe they are there. And that's really kind of the self-limiting constraints that keep us from having more serendipity, right? That we completely underestimate the likelihood of the unexpected, right? So we essentially assume that we know the variables and can plan them out. If we still have time later, we could do an experiment in the room itself around the birthday paradox. But it's really the idea that, and maybe if you want to put that into the chat, what do you think is the likelihood of two people in a room of 23 people, of two people having the same birthday? What do you think is the likelihood, approximately? Those of you who are good at maths, what do you think is the likelihood of two people in a room of 23 people to have the same birthday? So to celebrate on the same day. Any ideas what that might be? Is it 10%, 15%, 20%? Who's good at maths? Hugo says 2%, Lena 1%, Stuart 1%, Monica 1%. So what if I told you it's 50%? John is quite close, 40%. And that's flabbergasting, right? We would assume the probability is extremely low. I usually do an experiment. Osnat, happy birthday. Today is Osnat's birthday. Happy birthday, serendipitously so. So the fascinating thing is, right, the way we think about this kind of problem is very similar to how we approach life, right? We assume it's linear. We assume it's step by step. We can know the variables and so on. But this example, like life, is exponential. When you have 23 people in a room, if Osnat is person number 23, she has 22 people in this room who could have the same birthday. John still has 21 people who could have the same birthday. They didn't have the same birthday yet. Monica still has 20 people, and so on. And so you see it's an exponential function where it's actually to the power of. And so it's actually extremely likely in rooms of 70, 80, 90 people, it's almost 100%, it's 99% probability, I think in a room of 70-ish people, that two people have the same birthday. The reason I'm mentioning this is that this is similar to how we look at life, right? We think we can have a plan, we can map things out, but that lets us to overlook all these possibilities. We don't see the potato washing machine if we don't believe there could actually be some benefit in looking into the unexpected, positively surprising things. And so I'm actually a big fan within organizations to do small things like asking people in the weekly meeting, what surprised you last week? And then they start looking out for the positively unexpected. And they might say, well, it really surprised me that farmers were washing their potatoes in our washing machine. And what you're doing then is you're legitimizing the positively unexpected as, oh, that's part of our plan. It's not a threat to what we kind of supposedly did, it's part of our plan. But of course, a lot of people might perceive that as a threat. I work a lot with senior executives, and if you have a CEO who goes into the board meeting, you want to be able to say, I planned this, I did this, and then exactly this happened, right? You want to portray control at all times. You want to portray authority and so on. And the key focus of our work is to say, this is dishonest. It's dishonest, it's misleading, and we can't really learn from each other because everyone knows that, right? Everyone probably went with their CV to a future employer and said, I did this, then I did this, and then I did this. Yeah, or maybe you just bumped into someone at a conference and then this and this happened. And so what we do is we airbrush serendipity out of our stories, even though it's there all the time. And so what we've seen in our work, and we just finished a study, for example, with over 40 of the world's leading CEOs that are we set them down and we said, what is it that makes you really successful? And one of the key themes that came out of this, because they run big companies, but that have to be agile and have to kind of operate in ecosystems that allow them to be constantly innovative, they say we have a sense of direction. We know, if we're MasterCard, we want to get 500 million people into the financial system that were previously unbanked. This is the sense of direction. Here's an approximate strategy. But I'm telling you already now that I will adjust that strategy based on new information that comes in. And what that allows is you're allowing people to come in with unexpected new ideas. And instead of seeing that as a threat to leadership, as a threat to the marketing plan or whatever plan, actually it becomes part of the plan. And that's really what a lot of this work is about, to giving a language to that. It's actually a very active approach to leadership. Tom Linebarger, the CEO of Cummins, said it beautifully, that cultivating serendipity is an active approach to leadership during uncertainty. Because essentially what you're doing is you're building a culture, an organizational culture, and the mindset that allows you to navigate the unexpected, not in a kind of distracted way. You have a sense of direction, but you're doing this in a way that allows you to make the uncertainty your partner. Now, to wrap this up, here's a couple of brief examples of potential strategies of how we can have more serendipity. And then I'll hand over to Victoria for the second part. One of my absolute favorites of how we can create more serendipity in life and more broadly with our partners is casting hooks. And casting hooks is really about the idea of using 2 or 3 talking points that we can use in different conversations. Let's say, maybe we want to expand to Poland, or we want to find a partner in the XYZ industry, whatever it is. And then trying to sneak that into every conversation somewhere, especially with people where we usually might assume that they don't necessarily are in that industry. Someone who does that really well is Ollie Barrett, an entrepreneur in London. If you would ask Ollie this dreaded "what do you do" question, right, where you put people into boxes, he wouldn't just say, I'm a technology entrepreneur. He would say something like, I'm a technology entrepreneur, recently started reading into the philosophy of science, but what I'm really excited about is playing the piano. And so what he's doing here is he's giving you 3 potential hooks, 3 potential dots, where you could connect the dots and say, oh my God, such a coincidence. We are hosting piano sessions, you should stop by. Oh my God, such a coincidence. My sister is teaching on the philosophy of science, you should give a guest lecture. The point is, especially in networks, in communities and ecosystems, our ability to put those potential hooks out there and allow other people to pick that up becomes paramount. There was a session earlier about asking questions, so I won't dive into this, but it's really the more open-ended we frame questions away from the what do you do to what do you enjoy doing, the more likely it is that we actually find common denominators and overlaps. 2 other things, and then I'll wrap this up. One is really looking at mistakes and crises differently. I'm a big fan of things like project funerals, where essentially the idea is that you take a project that didn't work, and instead of trying to hide that, you're presenting that in front of different partners, in front of different teams, and you reflect on what didn't work. And by doing this, you allow other people to say, oh my God, yes, this idea didn't work in your context, but it might work in ours. Then a kind of window technology that doesn't sell because people don't buy windows might become an application for a solar company because it absorbs so much energy. And so unexpectedly, so there's those different usages. Another one is really around how do we reframe questions and situations. In a lot of companies, we have these departments, right? Tomography and this and this and this, which predefines the solution space. And now if I'm innovating, I'm making a better tomography machine versus if I would have called that department the precision diagnosis department, people could do tomography, but they could also do 20,000 other areas. Last but not least, of course, then really the kind of question of how do we leverage technology in space design? We're all probably missing these water cooler moments and those kind of moments where we bump into others. But we can recreate that online, right? So for example, one way is to have virtual coffee trials where people within the organization or within the whole ecosystem are giving a couple of times they're free, and then they get randomly matched with people across the ecosystem to go for a quick coffee and reflect on a challenge, right? what's our ecosystem challenge, what's our company challenge, what's my own challenge, whatever it is, and how can I help? And then essentially that creates that serendipity, but also that kind of sense of bonding and doing. So long story short, that's really about developing that North Star and at the same time, a muscle for the unexpected. My editor tells me to mention that this is all brought together in a book. And I wouldn't do justice to my heritage from Heidelberg, where we have this philosopher's way, if I wouldn't finish on a philosophical note of Goethe that kind of sums it all up. And Goethe used to say that if you take someone as they are, you make them worse. But if you take them as what they could be, you make them capable of becoming who they can be. And that's really what serendipity is about. Serendipity is about potentiality. It's about what could be. It's about seeing a little bit more in a moment than there is. And by doing this, enabling oneself and others to connect the dots and create more innovation, impact, and so on, especially in ecosystems that depend on people, that depend on networks, and so on. With this, I'm handing over to my very good friends and fantastic entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, community builder, Victoria Stoyanova, who has worked at companies from Facebook to helping EY and others to build effective ecosystems and communities. And I've always appreciated how she, says, look, it's not only about focusing on infrastructure and all that stuff. Community is at the core of everything, right? It's humans in the end that have to make sense out of AI and do something with it. And so, Victoria, over to you. And I'm looking forward to the conversation later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. This was fantastic, as usual, writing notes from your talks. Pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. I am really interested in the question of how do we create meaningful connections, and what you say just really resonates. I'm always thinking about you when there's a lovely moment of serendipity, and I sometimes even text you about it. There is something about when we think about qualitative connection, it's between companies, between individuals, between potential partners, and everything we do is about how we connect to what's around us. I love designer Charles Eames. He says, eventually everything connects, and it's about the quality of the connection. That's where the meaning lies. It's how qualitative that connection is. So in my world, I think a lot about how do we create a practice for serendipity? How do we allow conditions for serendipity to exist around what we do? So at the moment, I'm working with a very interesting Japanese holding company who has 12 different agencies underneath, and we're thinking about, in this ecosystem, how do we create opportunities for serendipity that then create more collaboration, that create more connection between individuals. And there's no one way to do it, but one of the ways to do that is to increase the opportunity of connection. So the more opportunities you have to practice, meeting someone randomly or hearing about a project, the more chances you have of this leading somewhere. And I think that's something to keep in mind. It's not that we have like check boxes of how much serendipity there was today, but there's something about just creating conditions, going for a walk, pinging someone on the Zoom chat because you liked what they said, just messaging someone you saw on Twitter, on Slack, messaging an author, a journalist. I do that all the time. Sometimes I just say, I love this article. I was curious about this other point. Is there anything that we can learn about this? I think sometimes we forget that behind all these concepts and structures is just people, and people really want to talk about the things that move them. And I guess that's another part of the energy that serendipity brings. It's exciting. It's exciting to connect the dot between a potential opportunity about what this could be. And I think sometimes we underestimate why things like water coolers or social chats or events, like why is it that it's so important? There's something about meeting individuals where they are in their experience right now. So that's something that I practice and I love and brings me a lot of joy. And I think another thing to practice is about why is this interesting? Kind of going the extra step and training the brain to connect the dots between, oh, I'm hearing this, what does that make me think of? And I'm sorry, at some point it does really take over your world and all you see is connections, but it's a really fun thing to get into. It's a little bit like in theater, they always say, yes and of just pushing forward and extending conversation to see what else is there. And I think that's a practice to do as you're hearing someone sharing about a project or a challenge or something exciting that happened to them. What does that immediately connect to, and sharing that back? I think that's also a very generous practice and builds a lot of relationship, because in a lot of these experiments and how the dots connect, if there is a stronger relationship between the people, then there's more trust, then experimentation can go faster and further. And then I guess the other thing is around just being in different environments, just going places, going to that dinner or that talk or that thing that you maybe don't feel quite excited about just now, but then it turns out to be more exciting. I think at the moment there is definitely an overall feeling broadly for employees, for managers, for everyone. Things feel a little bit stagnant and people feel a little bit overwhelmed and exhausted. So what are we doing to counter this energy, and where are we creating environments where people can remember that it's so nice to be around each other, where that's virtual or in real life? I forgot what it's called, in real life, that one. So yeah, this is kind of how I think about this. I'd love to have a conversation with you. And yeah, Stuart.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you, Christian. Victoria, one of the things you're involved with is the Institute of Belonging.
Yes, that is my passion project, Institute of Belonging. I think we just don't spend enough time looking at what does connection do to us as humans. So I look at a lot of nerdy papers and practices around why does connection matter, and what does it do to us, to our brains, to our body, and what are different experiments that we can try. So that's the Institute of Belonging. Thank you, Stuart.
Yeah, we all need to belong somewhere.
Yes.
And in ecosystems, I mean, Christian showed the slide where an ecosystem is mapped out at higher, and it looks very complex and scientific and impersonal. There's a big leap from that to creating a community and also creating serendipity. And they're the kind of polar opposites in many ways, aren't they? A kind of mechanical thing laid down on a piece of paper, and a kind of an embrace of serendipity and embrace of community, which is much more human. There's a huge gulf.
I see. Well, it depends how you look at it, because there's something about, I always think of an ecosystem exists out there. It's different pieces of a puzzle, and it's about how you connect it that you make different sense of it. And for example, with my work at Facebook, we're looking at how to invest in people who build community leaders. What kind of infrastructures do they need? How do we build financial mechanisms to invest in them? How do we connect them to other opportunities? Like, what do they need to thrive? And one of the exciting thing for me there was that, well, actually, we want these people to succeed, but we're not the only ones who want to do that. There are many other organizations in the world who also want the success of this specific group. So why are we not working together? And that was a big shift in how we worked as a team, because all of a sudden, the ecosystem players are also a community because they believe in the same goal. They have the same value system. They want to move the needle in the same direction. And so we built a community of ecosystem players, which then became a real way to move the needle.
Yeah, we should say that I believe it is Osnat's birthday. He wasn't planted in the audience. Yeah. Christian, you mentioned project funerals and admitting serendipity in your kind of life story and your bio and your seat resume, whatever you call it. That suggests a degree of, to be willing to do that, it's a degree of openness and honesty and being willingness to be upfront, which is often not a characteristic of organization leaders.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And I think, also to Victoria's earlier point, right? I think those kind of infrastructures and those kind of, technology infrastructures, AI-driven innovation, all these kind of things, yes, they can be extremely impersonal, but then actually the way you sense make out of them, the way you actually make them meaningful, that is a deeply human thing to do. And I think that requires community at its core. And I think good companies that I've been working with, what they usually do is exactly that. Their main focus, yes, technology is important, but technology is just a means to get stuff done. Like that's just a means to filter stuff, to kind of do things. But the actual meaning and the actual kind of higher level idea of what you can do with it still is humans, fortunately. And so that's really kind of this idea of, can I map networks? Can I map the multipliers and then understand who are these multipliers? And then I don't have to work with everyone, but I work with the key multipliers. And to Victoria's point, then you have a network of the multipliers versus like the network of everyone, which to your point gets completely confusing. And I think that's the fascinating thing about community building, that you can think about this very strategically. But I think to your point, what actually makes then a strong enough, culture and by extension, a strong enough internal community that allows for things like project funerals to happen. To your point, there's a certain vulnerability built in, right? And I think what I'm unfortunately seeing in most companies is they either are extremely quote unquote unvulnerable or extremely vulnerable, in the sense of either you have people who don't share at all, or you have people who tend to overshare, and then you kind of like, but ideally, obviously, you want to find something in the middle where you don't give a TED talk about, hey, I'm so vulnerable, but it's actually saying, no, like here is a meaningful connection that I'm trying to make. And to me, that really comes to the question of what is our mutual purpose here? What is our mutual values frame here that guides us so that we want to get something done together? I think, Stuart, we talked about this in the context of Suits, right? The Netflix series where, it's set in the context of a high-powered law firm, high-powered lawyers running around being competitors, Harvey Specter and Louis Litt, the two lawyers being extreme competitors. But then whenever it is about their protege, Mike, they really come together and they kind of like share, they get vulnerable with each other and they get stuff done because they have a joint purpose and a joint kind of values frame around that. And so I think that to me, and that's why I'm so excited about purpose-driven leadership, that at the end of the day, what we want to do is we need to set some preconditions that makes it more likely that people have an incentive to share. And I think one of the ways to do that is to get them excited about, the old Antoine Saint-Exupéry quote of don't tell people how to build the boat, make them long for the endlessness of the sea, and then actually people want to build the boat together. And I think that's at the core of that.
Is technology a bit of a red herring in this area? That people are kind of seduced by it and allow technology to do the work, and in some ways it's a substitute for, well, it is a substitute for human connection.
It's interesting, and Victoria, I'm sure you have amazing thoughts on this, because I think I remember, from our early days. So one of the communities I was involved in, we set up a community that we scaled into different countries, and I still remember the conversations about what kind of technology do you use to scale a community. It's one thing to, do an internal Facebook group for 5 people, but like, how do you scale that to hundreds and thousands of people? And how do you do that so that people still feel well connected enough that they care and that they have a feeling of community? And I think the biggest conversation we had is, how do we not fall prey to thinking that it's all about the technology and that it's all about maximizing the functionality of the technology, versus actually saying, no, what is this community all about? And how do people anyways communicate with each other? And how do we go on top of that, how they anyways communicate, versus trying to lead them somewhere else where they're not communicating? And so what I mean with this, we realized, look, a lot of times conversations start offline. So that's your starting point, and then allow them to continue that online and go further. And I think a lot of companies have done it the other way around, where they say, let's focus on technology, the best solutions, everything else. But then nobody uses the whiteboard, or nobody uses the kind of, yeah, you can find your idea here and do something with it. And so we actually just did a research project, AI and how AI can accelerate serendipity. And one of the key themes that comes out of it is AI in itself shuts down a lot of potential serendipity, because it focuses on the kind of framework of judgment that is being given, right? So you give them particular problem space and then they run with it. So they can surface interesting stuff, but they can't really imbue meaning and say, hey, the apple is falling, so that might be gravity. You know what I mean? So they can't make these metaphorical leaps that say, there's a real interesting innovation here that really helps like change something big here. And so I think that's the fascinating thing, to figure out what is the competence of technology and AI, right? Which we all know, it's efficient, it's scalable and things like that. But then also, what is the core purpose of the community around it? And how do we enable humans to actually operate the way they want to operate? And then the technology complements them rather than the other way around.
Yeah, Anastasia has made a point, quoting Steve Jobs. Intuition is a very powerful thing, more important than intellect. Can we perceive intuition as one way of deciphering serendipity-related instance? And how do we achieve this elegant balance between having a deeper and rather sensitive perception of the environment around us while still retaining a rational and practical mindset? And I think there is that, the elegant balance is a nice phrase, and that's called for in this area, isn't it? I think. Victoria?
Absolutely. I don't think yeah.
Thank you, Anastasia, for this beautiful question. I think there's something about, I don't know, there's something about not being afraid of the emotional side that serendipity actually creates. It is exciting. It does something to our body. Our brain is lit up in a different way. So in that way, it does produce something. So I think there is a fair amount of trust and, yes, intuition of, could this be interesting, and what do we want to do about it, and where is it safe to push further versus backing off. And I think that's kind of it, in a sense, it's an art. I mean, human relationships are an art. As much as they're tactical and practical, there's something about how does that feel, and is there something that we can go deeper in. So yeah, definitely. I think that's where the balancing happens, and just trusting the feeling about it.
And that's probably where it gets really interesting, right? To exactly your point, Victoria. One of the things that has come out of research, I think, a lot, is that when people shift from a naive gut feeling to a mature gut feeling, right? So that shift from, I think, when you're starting out and when you're kind of like, when something's extremely new and like you haven't seen patterns yet, you are in fight or flight. You're kind of like, you're just responding to kind of threats or things, opportunities, and it's a relatively animalistic kind of gut-only type approach. But then when you will see like high-powered executives, they will always tell you, yeah, I did this because I planned this and this. Yeah, no, you just had a gut feeling and then you went with it and then you made up a story why you made it, right? And so the point is that a lot of times those people, when you then dissect it, they will think, well, it was, you know, I tried to make my gut feeling rational, but actually what they did before that was they became really good at pattern recognition, right? It's like when you're dating, that in a way, once you dated 2 or 3 times a particular type of person, you see the red flags, right? Your intuition tells you, they don't even have to speak, you just see how they act and you sense it, right? And I think that's what you know, in that work with senior executives comes out a lot in terms of saying that they are extremely good at mature gut feeling, at shifting towards away from just fight or flight, this kind of just sensing and then reacting to it out of fear or out of something that is just a stimulant, to no, let me get as much information as I can. Let me try to understand the patterns behind it. Let me reflect on the gut, and then I decide based on the gut, because my subconscious probably has much more information than my conscience and my rational self. And I think that's the power of what Victoria mentioned. There's this kind of additional component to what we just can't rationalize. And I think that's the art of serendipity.
Yeah, and I think there's also a lot of play in it. I think we forget that a lot of ideas that are truly innovative come from the sense of, would it be crazy to consider this? And what if we try that? So there's a certain element of giving it a go, because there isn't that much to risk. It's like when, you know, you meet someone who you think you'd like to get to know more for whatever context, there is a sense of, well, you need to put your hat in the ring. Like there is a little bit of risk involved, and it's okay. When you think about, well, what's the worst that can happen? Someone might say, oh, let's park this idea for later. Well, it's really okay, isn't it? So there's something about, yeah, what's at risk?
And pattern recognition can be a slow process vis-a-vis dating.
Very true, very true. Very painful also, right? Yeah.
Yeah, that's why there are websites for these things. What about the cultural? It strikes me that there's huge cultural differences, that and attitudes in towards serendipity and attitudes towards community are obviously very different in different places in the world. What about serendipity, Christian? Are there different attitudes in Asia, say, to the West?
You know, it's really interesting, because when you think about it, you know, I grew up in Germany and we love planning, we love mapping things out, we love having a plan, right? And so the education system pushes you towards make a plan, know exactly what you want to do in the next 20 years, and then go out there. And then you go out in the real world and you're like, oh my God, like all this unexpected stuff happening. And then you go to India or Kenya, where a lot of my work is based, and you know, people are kind of like resourceful in the moment and like create things out of what's there, with not the same degree of and again, I'm not someone to just put, but if you look at it at the continuum between, let's say, planning and emergence, for example, you will see that cultures will have different kind of characteristics in general, and then everyone is idiosyncratic. But I think what's fascinating in this is that I think this kind of mindset that we're speaking about brings together those two worlds. It says, yes, by any means you should plan. By any means you should have a plan, because that gives you a sense of direction, that gives you a sense of accomplishment, that gives you a sense of, feeling that you're progressing. That's important. But at the same time, make it part of your plan to have the unexpected emerge. And so I think then essentially, yes, there's differences between cultures, but also within each culture, we can develop the mindset that helps us to do that. And I'm always fascinated, Stuart, I think the deeper question behind what you're asking, what are we allowed, right? What are we allowed in terms of, to Victoria's beautiful point about play, for example, right? If you have cultures where it's looked down upon that you're playful, curious, where it's essentially kind of the more kind of top-down idea of seniority and everything else, it's harder to, people self-censor more. People will not be in the meeting and say, oh my God, I have this unexpected idea, right? They will not raise it. And so that's why I'm so fascinated by how we can, in every culture, create mechanisms that allow people, that legitimize the unexpected by simple things, right? In a meeting, I loved what Pixar used to do, which is essentially going into a meeting and saying, so at the Pixar, the company that does like Finding Nemo and all these different beautiful cartoons, talk about play, and the founder would go in, or the CEO would go in and say, at the beginning, all of our ideas are bad, start. And now essentially, especially as a young person, you have the license to not have to be perfect. And I think the legitimizing of imperfection, the legitimizing that it's okay to not always be perfect, I think that's a huge step towards this. We don't want to celebrate failure, but we want to celebrate positive experimentation towards something that actually is useful. And I think that's a big difference. There's all these fail cons that focus a lot on failure, but I think the real interesting thing is about focusing on the learning from what didn't work, and then what can you do differently next time.
So you never get promoted for serendipity, or do you?
Well, funny enough, when you look at those CEOs, I mean, Stuart, that's the funny thing, right? When you look at all these CEOs, they are serendipity cultivators, but they always had to hide it a lot of times, right? A lot of them would not have said, I got where I am because of serendipity. But when they look back and narrate their stories, you would see serendipity everywhere. And then you say, wow, what you essentially did is you cultivated serendipity. And they would be like, oh my God, I didn't even look at it this way, that I was actually really passive. I just thought I worked hard and had a bit of luck. No, you worked hard to have more luck.
Did perspectives change over the pandemic, Victoria? When you're talking about community now, are people more understanding of what that means and what that involves, do you think?
I mean, community has changed a lot throughout the pandemic. I think it's tightened up like smaller communities and made stronger connections. I think it's been harder to have serendipitous encounters with people from all around the world. I think it's been a little bit different. Now we see more and more things opening up and having different types of events and kind of addressing how things feel and where people are at. Yeah, at the moment I'm working with this big company, and there's something about people are feeling quite exhausted. So what are we doing for that? What are things that feel energizing and generous and exciting and filled with inspiration versus, oh, go here to connect with other colleagues, and that feels like work. So there's something about, we've spent, the last 2 years in our little Zoom squares. How can we make that experience just a bit more exciting and add a bit of fun? And it can be done in so many simple ways. I was recently at an event where people were paired in Zoom, or just paired in breakout rooms, and they just had to look at a specific date in their photo album on their phone and just explain what that memory was. It was just like 3 key dates, and everyone had to do that. And it was really funny because you're like, oh, well, this is me on that biking trip, and this happened. And you just get to meet facets of people you wouldn't go to that easily online. So there's a lot of small different ways they can pepper that in. But on the community front, I think community has always been about finding your people, and whatever you're going through, wherever you're working on, whatever support you need, knowing that there is a group of people out there who are doing exactly the same thing as you. So particularly powerful in moments of transition, particularly powerful when we feel like we're on our own and we need another group to sense make with. And yeah, I feel like at the moment, the future of work topic is really, really on fire. There's been, great resignation, and now what is happening next? And a lot of companies are asking questions around what does it mean to attract and retain talent, like more than ever. And it's really interesting how community and belonging actually plays a huge role in, well, why would you stay? Like, what is your connection to this place? And how can you deepen that on a daily basis with small, simple looking interactions, but actually that create a strong bond, because ultimately we stay for the people, right? We belong to a group. Yeah.
Most people change jobs because they don't like their boss.
Yes.
In reality.
And isn't that, I find that fascinating. So on exactly that point, right? That when you think about it, we all just had a collective near-death experience, right? We all just essentially, I mean, my baby girl, like, I didn't know if my parents could visit her here in the US, like as they are in Germany. Like, I would never have assumed 2 years ago that borders would just close like this around the world, and just like this, things happen, right? And so, I mean, indeed expect the unexpected, but to that degree, I wasn't prepared. And so it's fascinating to me that when you think about it that way, I spend a lot of time around people who face death. I had 2 near-death experiences in my life. And when you face death, you generally don't care anymore about, how many cars are in your garage, or, all these kind of materialistic things. And a lot of the things I think we talk about in business, right? Nobody cares when you're on a deathbed. What you care about is, have I created the meaningful connections I wanted to create? Have I lived up to who I could have been in terms of my values? And I think those kind of questions, and that to me is the big opportunity companies have at the moment. And exactly Victoria's point, that we can now say, now is the time where we can rethink how we create community around this to truly have meaningful connection, because that's the only thing there is. If I can take my laptop here and I can work at Facebook as much as I can work at Google without having to change location, that's the only thing. Meaningful connection. Like, how do I feel I belong to you? Do I feel this makes sense? And then, of course, there's a couple of financial things and everything else. But I think at the core of it, and Stuart, to your earlier question, I think the beautiful thing at the moment is, I think there's a reassessment of what is meaningful to us. And there's such a pressure on it that I think for the first time, there's like a qualitative shift, I think, in how companies, we've seen this incremental kind of purpose-driven leadership thing for the last 15 years. But I think now people are like just fed up of companies who are not doing it.
There's a question from Eugenio. Could it be that we're wired to see serendipitous moments, but we lose our perception with our logical thinking? In that, which I guess what he's getting at is, naturally we pick them up, but then we kind of rationalize them out of our worldview. You think there's some truth in that?
I love that question. I think there's something relating to the sense of play and creativity. We're all wired for play and creativity. That's how we are as humans, but then there's something about rationalizing of, oh, this is not the way to be, and let's be serious, and this is how to interact. And there's something about, I think it's actually a lot to do with quieting the goal-orientated part of the brain and the ego, actually, because when you're spotting an opportunity and you think that there's something exciting in that, the first kind of the energy is not, oh, how can that be good for me? It's more around, that's interesting. I wonder what else is there? And maybe the energy is more about how can you help that person and make it useful for them versus what is in there for me. And so I think there's something about, maybe if we quiet down the part of the brain that needs to make things happen and things need to follow a certain goal, then we have more space for serendipity. And I think, yeah, there's a lot about a sense of space.
It reminds me of, so I just had a baby girl. You might hear her in the background from time to time. She's a little Buddha usually, but somehow whenever I have a speech, she wakes up. But what I found fascinating is when thinking about how education systems educate us out of creativity, right? I mean, Ken Robinson and others had these beautiful kind of thoughts around this, that in a way, the way we grow up is very focused on pricing rationality higher than kind of intuition. It's focused on logical things and so on. And that's how you advance in life a lot of times, officially. And then unofficially, people get actually really good at mature gut feelings, but they don't necessarily tell people about it. And so it's hard to learn around this. And so that's where the tacit kind of learning comes in, where people learn more from the people they're around, which again exacerbates societal inequality. So I'm actually a big fan of really thinking about how we start with education systems and companies of saying, yes, by any means, let's put curiosity at the core of it. I would, for example, in schools, I would make The Little Prince required reading. I would literally say this beautiful book that's all about this little prince that walks around and just asks why all the time. And just like, yeah, why are you counting all these stars so that you can get more stars, and then you count more stars to get more stars? So what's the point, right? And I think that's the kind of same thing when you look at how, you know, this curve that shows how people like get quote unquote a bit happier when they have a bit more income, but at some point it just kind of like stalls, and then it even goes negatively because we're so relative to others, right? We're always, if I don't have money, I want to be a millionaire. If I want to be a millionaire, once I am a millionaire, I want to be a billionaire. So my reference group shifts constantly, and so I'm constantly kind of like running up, and I'm not celebrating those kind of successes and things. And so I think letting go of this kind of idea that there is this kind of outside pressure, and that comes back to this deathbed regrets. I mean, highly recommended, those of you interested, when you Google deathbed regrets, there's a nun that like she wrote down, she listened to people and asked, what is your regrets in life? And it's really always the same stuff. And it really comes back to exactly Victoria's point. They didn't allow themselves to be curious about the things they truly cared about, but they followed what other people wanted from them. And I think that's kind of the shift also. And I think that's the power at the moment that in a way, a lot of people got when you have some kind of expertise, that you can shift towards something that feels more meaningful. And I think that's a beautiful opportunity for companies.
Yeah, we should reference Dan Pink's new book, which is about regret, and which is depressing reading actually in many ways. But so ego works against serendipity, in short. So Christian, you've been involved in various organizations. How did these ideas play out in practice in those organizations?
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because so one of the first organizations I was essentially involved was a community called Sandbox Network, and it's you know, essentially selects people from different fields who are pushing boundaries, you know, designers, architects, business people, and then brings them together in one community based on the premise that usually when you are you know, like in a certain field, you're connected in your own fields, but mindset-wise, you're closer to other crazy people in other fields who are pushing the boundaries. And so the core idea there was bring them together. And what was fascinating is you would go to dinner in the evenings, and people would constantly go, oh my God, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence, such a coincidence. And so in a way, we got really excited about this idea. Is this a serendipity accelerator? Is this something where if you create the conditions of similar values, but different perspectives, and that's, you know, again, also kind of now coming out of a lot of the research, I think, but like this idea of that you have conditions that in a way allow people to share, but at the same time also be different and crazy in a way, and that usually leads to a lot of kind of interesting things. And so that kind of really got me excited about this idea in the community context, that actually people, you know, you can create the conditions for this. But then, you know, when I think, Stuart, about the way how the companies that I helped set up emerged, the way how literally I found the love of my life, how my baby girl is here, that was all serendipity. And when I trace it back, it's always kind of very similar reasons for why it happens. And I think it comes a lot back to a couple of the points Victoria mentioned. But I think what I focus a lot on in the work with organizations is really saying, how do we, in a way, do that in a way that doesn't distract us, right? So I think to your point earlier, it's one thing, I think there's a lot of magic in serendipity. So there's a lot of pleasure, a lot of joy that comes from it. And I think that's beautiful, and I think that's great. But both for individuals and for organizations, we also obviously want to channel that and not kind of like just be all over the place and say, oh my God, like now I could also do this and this and this and this. I think that's how people then look back in 20 years and say, I wished I had focused a bit more. And so I'm a big fan of really saying, let's identify these key curiosities, key values, key principles to have a sense of direction. And then within that force field, that's where we create serendipity. And someone who has been really good at this is Paul Polman, right? The former CEO at Unilever. He would essentially say, look, I could have become a priest. He first wanted to become a priest because he essentially said, look, I want to help people. I want to create platforms or develop things that help people. And he realized I can actually do that more effectively in business. So let me use Unilever. And then essentially everything that fits into the vision I have for this, unexpected ideas, very welcome. If it doesn't fit, I'm sorry, another time. And the same in his own life. And I think that's kind of like what I've gotten really excited about, that we can in a way build that muscle for the unexpected without getting distracted.
Well, perhaps businesses should be looking out for people who once wanted to be priests. It's like pattern recognition. Poets were recruited by MI5 during the war, the code breakers during the war, because they're very good at pattern recognition. So perhaps we should be looking in unusual places. So where does this work go next? Victoria, where does your work go next? What have you got underway, and what should we be looking out for?
I'm looking at cracking quite a complex system between 12 different companies right now and seeing how to create more serendipity between them. So I'll keep you posted on how that goes. And if anyone wants to read more on thoughts about connection and how that makes us feel, it's on Institute of Belonging.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Victoria. Christian, you got another book in the pipeline?
Well, so to be honest, like what I found fascinating is, look, everything that I've learned over the last 10 years as entrepreneur, social entrepreneur, as community builder, as academic is in that book. So my kind of next 5 to 10 years are committed to saying, how do we take that content into as many educational institutions, into as many organizations as possible? And what I found fascinating, you know, when the book came out, I thought it would be mostly for business people and like people in organizations to create a culture. But then I would have psychologists reach out and say, oh my God, this is a toolkit for me to use with patients to decrease anxiety, because then the unexpected isn't just a threat. And then I would have parents who say, oh my God, this is a way to reconnect with my kids when I don't know what to talk about now that they're stuck at home. And so it's kind of these type of things where I feel the next 5 to 10 years is about saying, how do we take that content and contextualize it into different areas, from education to parenting to business to you name it. And so that's really the focus. And you know, me coming from a culture where I have a lot of anxiety about the unexpected naturally, and I have a lot of anxiety about uncertainty. To me also, it's been almost like a kind of medication for myself to kind of work on that content and realize, actually, you know what, the unexpected has a lot of, to Victoria's point, has a lot of joy in there, has a lot of things in there. And it's sure, that's how we connected serendipitously. So we developed our relationship serendipitously. So a lot of beautiful things coming out of it.
I mean, the good thing about serendipity and community is that they're universal. They're not just business related. They are everyone, no matter what their activities, at all times. Hopefully. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Victoria. Thank you very much, Christian. A brilliant end to the first day of our virtual event. Really appreciate everyone who's joined us for this final session, and thank you to you both for joining us. I think I really enjoyed it, and everyone who watched really enjoyed it. Lots of food for thought.
Thank you so much.